don't know what you thought of me.
Pretty amazing.
Does Prince William have a favourite toy?
Jamie, he loves his koala bear he's got. But he hasn't got anything particular. He just likes something with a bit of noise. He got a plastic whale that throws things out the top, little balls.
There is a version of this story most people already think they know. A fairy tale wedding, a prince, a princess who smiled for the cameras and said all the right things. But by her own account, years later, Diana would describe that image as a performance, one she kept giving long after she'd stopped believing in it herself. Somewhere between the wedding in 1981 and the separation announced in 1992, something shifted, not in public, in private, in the small, unremarkable moments nobody was filming. This isn't the story of a scandal breaking, it's the story of a decision quietly forming, long before the world had any idea it had already been made. And to understand how Diana finally reached that point, you have to go back to the beginning of a marriage that was, by nearly every account, broken before it started. Here's the truth. By the time Charles and Diana married in July 1981, the two of them had spent barely 13 days together in private before the engagement was announced. Charles was 32, under mounting pressure from the press and from his own family to settle down. Diana was 19, largely unknown to the public, and, by most biographers' accounts, chosen partly because she fit a very specific set of requirements. She was young, aristocratic, and had no romantic history that could embarrass the monarchy. In other words, she looked right on paper before anyone had really asked whether the two of them worked as people. That distinction matters, because it shapes almost everything that follows. This wasn't a marriage that formed slowly out of shared history. It was a marriage assembled quickly, under public expectation, between two people who barely knew each other, and who, crucially, wanted very different things from the relationship. Diana, by her own later description, had grown up on romantic ideals. She wanted partnership, closeness, a real emotional bond. Charles had grown up inside an institution that treated marriage primarily as duty, continuity, and image. Neither of those instincts is monstrous on its own, but they are almost impossible to reconcile once the cameras are gone and only two people are left in a room. There is just one problem with the fairy tale version of this wedding. It was never actually a love story in the way the world was sold. It was a transaction between a young woman's hope and an institution's need for stability. And that mismatch, hope colliding with obligation, is the seed of everything that eventually drove Diana to walk away. No account of Charles and Diana's relationship can honestly be told without addressing Camilla Parker Bowles, and this is where the standard narrative usually oversimplifies. The popular version treats Camilla as a betrayal that arrived after the marriage soured. The more accurate version, according to multiple biographers and Charles's own later acknowledgement, is that his relationship with Camilla long predated Diana, and that the emotional bond between them never fully ended, even as he proceeded with his engagement and marriage to Diana. Diana appears to have suspected this almost immediately. In her own later interviews, she described finding out early in the marriage that Camilla remained a significant presence in Charles's life, not necessarily through a single dramatic discovery, but through a slow accumulation of small, undeniable signs. A cufflink, a diary entry, the way certain phone calls were handled. Individually, none of these moments would end a marriage. Together, over years, they eroded any remaining trust. And that matters, because it reframes what actually broke this marriage. It wasn't one betrayal at one moment. It was the daily experience of being married to someone whose emotional loyalty appeared to sit elsewhere, while being required, publicly, to perform the opposite. Diana wasn't just grieving a husband's divided affection. She was being asked to smile through it, night after night, in front of cameras that had no idea what they were actually photographing. To understand why Diana didn't simply leave earlier, you have to understand what she was actually up against. Not just a difficult marriage, but an institution she would later refer to, pointedly, as the firm. The royal family operates less like a household and more like a corporation with its own internal logic, protocol over emotion, image management over honesty, and a deeply ingrained belief that private difficulties should never be allowed to threaten public stability. Diana entered that system at 19, with no formal preparation for what it would demand of her. She has described the isolation of those early years vividly, a young woman largely cut off from her old friendships, operating inside a rigid structure of protocol, surrounded by staff whose loyalty ultimately ran to the institution rather than to her personally. When she struggled emotionally, the response from those around her was frequently to manage the situation quietly rather than to address it directly. Her bulimia, which she later spoke about candidly, developed during this period, a private response to pressures she had almost no outlet to express. This is the part that's easy to miss if you only know the tabloid version of Diana's story. She wasn't reluctant to leave the marriage because she didn't understand how bad it was. She stayed, for years, because leaving the firm wasn't simply a matter of walking out of a house. It meant challenging an institution built specifically to prevent exactly that kind of rupture, one with centuries of practice in managing crises quietly, and enormous cultural weight behind the idea that royal marriages simply do not end. What makes this period so psychologically strange is the sheer gap between what the public saw and what was actually happening. Through most of the 1980s, Diana was arguably the most photographed woman in the world, endlessly documented smiling beside Charles at official engagements, radiant at galas, tender with her young sons. That image became, in a sense, its own trap. The more beloved the fairy tale became publicly, the harder it became for Diana to acknowledge privately how far from the truth it actually was. She later described the strange dissonance of performing warmth toward Charles for cameras, while privately feeling increasingly alone in the marriage. This wasn't occasional. It was a near constant condition of her public life throughout much of the decade. Smile here, wave there, appear united, while the actual relationship behind that image continued to deteriorate. Royal biographers who covered this period consistently note the same pattern: private distance, public performance, and an ever-widening gap between the two. And that gap did something important psychologically. It didn't just make Diana unhappy, it made her doubt her own read on reality. When the entire world insists you are living a fairy tale, and you privately know you are not, it becomes disorienting. Several biographers point to this period as when Diana began to feel less like a person and more like a role she was required to keep performing, whether or not the underlying story was still true. There wasn't one single event that changed everything. There were several spaced out over years, each chipping away at whatever hope Diana still held that the marriage could be repaired. One was the realization, confirmed repeatedly rather than discovered once, that Camilla remained central to Charles's emotional life, regardless of any reassurances to the contrary. Another was the arrival of her sons, William and Harry. Motherhood gave Diana a source of purpose and identity entirely separate from her role as Charles's wife, and by several accounts, it was through her relationship with her children that she began reconnecting with a version of herself that existed independently of the marriage. A third was her expanding charitable work, visiting AIDS patients, engaging directly with landmine survivors, work that gave her not just purpose but public credibility entirely of her own making, distinct from the royal machine that had, until then, largely defined her value in terms of image alone. Each of these, separately, gave Diana something she'd been missing since 1981, an identity that didn't depend on Charles, or on the marriage succeeding, or on maintaining a fairy tale for an audience that had no idea what was actually happening behind it. And that matters enormously, because it's very difficult to leave a life you're entirely dependent on. It becomes considerably more possible once you've quietly built something of your own to stand on instead. By the early 1990s, accounts from those close to Diana describe a woman who had stopped waiting for the marriage to improve and started quietly preparing for a different life. There is no single verified night captured on record with cinematic precision, no dramatic scene of Diana staring out a window at a fixed hour, deciding. What biographers and those close to her instead describe is something quieter and, in some ways, more devastating, an accumulation of ordinary evenings, identical to hundreds before them, in which she simply stopped extending Charles the benefit of the doubt. Friends and biographers who spoke to her during this period describe a shift not in what was happening in the marriage, much of that had been static for years, but in Diana's relationship to it. She stopped hoping. That distinction is enormous, because as long as she was hoping the marriage might still work, staying inside the firm carried at least the promise of a future worth staying for. Once that hope was gone, staying carried no purpose beyond obligation. And obligation, for Diana, had never been enough on its own. It had been the very thing she felt trapped by since 1981. By the time she agreed to cooperate, anonymously at first, with journalist Andrew Morton for what would become the explosive 1992 biography Diana, Her True Story, the decision had, in practical terms, already been made. The public separation that followed later that year wasn't the moment Diana decided to leave. It was the public catching up to a decision that had, quietly, already happened. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about this story is that it was never really about a single dramatic exit. It was about a slow, cumulative reclaiming of a self that had been buried under duty, protocol, and an image the public adored, but that had almost nothing to do with the woman living inside it. Diana's decision to leave wasn't reckless or sudden, regardless of how it may have appeared to a public conditioned by fairy tale expectations. It was the product of over a decade of quiet erosion, a marriage built on mismatched expectations, a rival relationship that never fully ended, an institution built to discourage exactly this kind of rupture, and a woman who spent years performing a happiness she'd stopped feeling long before the world ever found out. That's what makes her story worth returning to. Not the scandal, not the headlines, the quieter, more human truth underneath them. That sometimes the bravest decision a person makes isn't dramatic at all. It's simply the moment they stop pretending, even when pretending is what everyone around them still expects. Real Records is dedicated to uncovering the real stories behind history's most public lives. If you enjoyed this deep dive, consider subscribing.